When a baby was left helpless, a K9 police dog's rescue will melt your heart. A raging fire traps a baby inside their home. All hope seems lost. The flames grow ferocious, and the rescue team struggles until a K9 police dog defies all odds. With unwavering courage, he charges into the inferno, risking everything for a child he's never met. But will he make it out in time, or will his heroism come at the ultimate cost? The night was quiet until the fire came. It started with a small spark, hidden in the basement of the old apartment building, where a worn-out electrical panel finally failed. At first, it was just a flicker, a tiny glow in the darkness. Then, within seconds, it grew, spreading like a living thing, twisting and curling as it climbed up the walls. The flames moved fast, running through the wooden floors and up the staircase, searching for air, for space, for something more to burn. Thick, dark smoke rolled through the hallways, creeping under doors and slipping through cracks. It moved like a silent shadow at first, unseen, but then it filled every corner, heavy and choking. People woke up coughing, their eyes stinging. Shouts rang out. Doors slammed open. Some ran, feet pounding on the floor, trying to escape, but the smoke was everywhere. The fire roared now, a deep, hungry sound, swallowing everything in its path. Heat pressed against the walls, making the air thick and choking. A few streets away, Olivia Hayes hurried through the cold night. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath forming white clouds in the air. Her little boy, Charles, had been sick all day. His tiny body was hot with fever, his soft cries breaking her heart. She had finally got him to sleep, but she had run out of medicine. The pharmacy was close. She had left in a rush, promising herself she would be back before he even noticed she was gone. But as she turned the last corner, the sight stopped her breath. Her home, her building, was on fire. Flames poured from the windows like angry waves, dancing high into the night sky. Smoke curled upward in thick, black coils. A bright orange glow lit up the street, casting long shadows across the street. People stood outside, their faces pale in the firelight, some covering their mouths, others shouting. A woman cried somewhere in the crowd. A man was coughing, bent over, trying to catch his breath. Olivia's heart slammed against her ribs. Charles. She ran, pushing through the gathering crowd. The heat hit her before she even reached the front of the building, pressing against her skin like an invisible wall. She barely noticed. All she could see was the flames, the fire eating away at the place where her baby slept. A strong arm grabbed her just as she lunged forward. "You can't go in there." A deep voice shouted over the noise. She twisted, fighting against the grip. It was a firefighter, his face streaked with soot, his helmet reflecting the fire's glow. "My son is in there," she screamed, her voice breaking. "Please, he's in there alone." The firefighter held on her tightly. "We're doing everything we can. You have to stay back." "No." Her chest tightened, panic choking her. "He's just a baby. He's sleeping. He doesn't know what's happening." Tears spilled down her face. Her whole body shook, but not from the cold. "Please, please, I have to go to him." The man's eyes softened, but he didn't let go. Behind him, other firefighters rushed around, hoses blasting water at the flames, but the fire was wild. The water hissed against the heat, turning to steam, but the fire didn't care. It climbed higher, greedy and unstoppable. Inside, someone screamed. A window shattered. More people coughed. Olivia's knees almost collapsed. She could still see Charles in her mind, his tiny body curled up in bed, his soft breathing, his warm little fingers gripping hers as she whispered that everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay. He was in there, and she was out here. She tried to break free again, but the firefighter held her firm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calmer now, but still urgent. "We will get him out. I promise. But you have to let us do our job." Her breath came in short, painful gasps. The smoke burned her throat, the heat pressing against her like a heavy blanket. The fire was alive, moving fast, destroying everything in its way. And somewhere inside, her baby was waiting for her. "Let me go," she sobbed, clawing at the man's arms. "I need to get to my son." "You can't," the firefighter said, his voice steady but urgent. "All the exits are blocked. There's no way in." His words hit her like a punch. She shook her head violently, refusing to believe it. No, there has to be a way, she cried. Break a door down, go through a window, something. The man's face twisted with sympathy, but behind it, she saw something even worse, helplessness. He wanted help. He wanted to save Charles. But the fire was faster, stronger. It was winning. The stairwell collapsed. Another firefighter shouted over the chaos, rushing toward them. His uniform was smeared with soot, and his face was streaked with sweat. The whole thing caved in. There's no way up. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. No. The word barely came out, a broken whisper. Her knees felt weak. Her body trembled. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. The firefighter turned to his team. Pull back, he ordered. The structure's too unstable. Olivia barely heard him. Her mind raced, her heart hammering against her ribs. Charles is in there. My baby is in there. She looked up at the building, her vision blurred by tears. Flames crawled out of the windows, reaching higher and higher, devouring everything. The glass exploded outward, sending shards raining onto the street. The fire was moving too fast. Do something, she screamed, turning to the firefighters, her voice shaking with desperation. Please, you have to save him. Please. The men exchanged looks, and that silence made her stomach drop. They had no plan. They had no way in. Her legs buckled, and she dropped to her knees, her fingers digging into the pavement. A sob tore from her throat, raw and painful. He's just a baby, she whispered, barely able to breathe. He's all I have. Then a siren wailed in the distance, then stopped abruptly. Tires screeched against the pavement. A black SUV came to a sudden halt near the burning building, its doors flying open. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his sharp eyes scanning the fire with quick, practiced precision. Beside him, a large Belgian Malinois leaped from the vehicle, its muscular body tense, its ears alert. Detective David Cole had seen fires before. He had seen wreckage, disaster, and chaos in his years as an officer. But something about this one made his stomach tighten. Maybe it was the sheer speed of the flames, how they consumed the building like they were starving. Or maybe it was the woman on the ground, sobbing, her whole body shaking with terror. He moved quickly, his canine partner, Bulit, at his side. The dog sniffed the air, ears twitching, his sharp eyes locked on the burning structure. What's the situation? David asked as he approached the firefighters. His voice was calm, controlled. Years of experience had trained him to stay steady, no matter how bad things looked. Fire started in the basement, one of the firefighters said. Electrical panel failure. Spread too fast to contain. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. Stairwell collapsed. We have people trapped. No way up. David's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to Olivia, who was still on her knees, rocking back and forth, whispering something over and over. Who's in there? He asked, though he already knew. The firefighter exhaled. A child. A baby. Third floor. David cursed under his breath. He had been on the force long enough to know how these situations usually ended. Fire didn't wait. It didn't give second chances. If the stairwell was gone, if the flames had already spread this far, time was running out. Any other access points? He asked. The firefighter hesitated. One, he admitted. Side window, second floor. But it's too risky. We can't get a ladder up in time, and the structure might not hold. David's gaze snapped to the side of the building, scanning quickly. Flames had reached the top floors, but the lower side still had a chance. Maybe. Bulit let out a sharp bark, his nose twitching. He could smell something. Someone. David's grip on the leash tightened. His heart pounded, but his face remained unreadable. He had made impossible rescues before. He had walked into danger more times than he could count. But this was different. This was a baby, and there was no way in. Not yet. Bulit's muscles tensed as he sensed the danger ahead. Without hesitation, he leaped onto the fire department ladder, his paws landing with swift precision on each rung. Smoke billowed from the shattered window above, but he didn't slow down. His instincts screamed at him to move faster. David followed close behind, struggling to keep up with the dog's speed. As soon as Bulit reached the window, he lunged inside, disappearing into the thick, suffocating smoke. The heat pressed in from all sides, the air so thick with soot that it burned Bulit's throat with every breath. But he didn't falter. His sharp eyes scanned the room, but visibility was near zero. He relied on his nose, sniffing deeply through the haze, filtering out the acrid stench of burning wood and fabric to focus on what mattered most: life. Flames crackled, devouring everything in their path. Ash rained from the ceiling, and a chunk of drywall crashed down inches from Bulit's tail. He didn't flinch. His ears twitched, filtering through the chaos, his heart pounding as he moved deeper into the apartment. He could feel the heat intensify, the fire growing more aggressive with every second. But he pushed forward, weaving past the wreckage, dodging falling debris as he searched. Outside, Olivia's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. The building seemed alive with fire, its insides glowing an angry orange. She searched desperately for any sign of movement, but the window was nothing but darkness and smoke. Her chest tightened. The silence was unbearable. She didn't even realize she was whispering her son's name over and over under her breath, as if somehow it would keep him safe. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not until she knew. Inside, Bulit froze. His ears perked. A sound, faint but unmistakable, cut through the roaring fire. A weak, fragile cry. His body stiffened, adrenaline surging through him. He turned sharply, tracking the sound to a door half hidden behind a collapsed bookshelf. He barked, short and sharp, pawing at the door. Behind it, the cry came again, weaker this time. There was no mistaking it now. There was a baby inside. David, struggling to navigate through the swirling smoke, coughed violently, his lungs burning. Bulit's urgent barking cut through the chaos, guiding him like a beacon. He stumbled forward, eyes stinging, barely making out the dog's form through the haze. His heart pounded as he saw where Bulit had stopped. A door. A closed door. Bulit barked again, more frantic now, clawing at the wood. The fire was creeping closer, licking at the walls, feeding hungrily on the oxygen in the room. There was no time. David took a deep breath and threw his weight against the door. It didn't budge. He gritted his teeth, bracing himself, then slammed his shoulder into it again. This time it cracked, but not enough. A third time, and the wood finally splintered, the door swinging open with a groan. A small crib stood against the far wall, almost untouched by the destruction around it. In it, baby Charles lay motionless, his tiny face pale, his breath shallow. For a terrifying second, David thought he was too late. But then the baby let out a faint whimper, and relief surged through him. Bulit didn't wait. He bounded forward, his nose brushing against the baby, his warm breath ghosting over the child's face. Charles stirred slightly, but he was too weak to react. David wasted no time. He reached into the crib, his hands trembling as he scooped the baby up, pressing him protectively against his chest. The boy was barely conscious, his small body limp. Just as David turned to leave, a loud, ear-splitting crack shattered the air. The hallway they had come from gone. A wall of fire erupted in its place, blocking their only known exit. David's stomach twisted. The flames were moving fast, closing in from all sides. The smoke thickened, choking the remaining air out of the room. There was no way back. Bulit whined, pacing in place, his mind working. Then, suddenly, he turned and ran toward the window they had entered through. But instead of stopping, he pushed forward to the far corner of the room, sniffing along the baseboards, his ears twitching. He paused, looking back at David, his eyes sharp and focused. He barked once, urgently. David hesitated, clutching Charles tighter. The flames were closing in, every second pushing them closer to being trapped. But Bulit wasn't panicked. He was leading them somewhere. Trusting the dog completely, David followed, his heart hammering against his ribs. As soon as he reached Bulit's side, he saw it. A window, smaller than the one they had entered through, but intact. And on the other side, hope. The metal structure of a fire escape clung to the outside of the building, its steps leading down to safety. Bulit wagged his tail once again and turned his gaze back to David. The message was clear. This was their way out. The fire raged behind them, its hungry flames reaching closer, filling the room with unbearable heat. Smoke curled through the air, thick and suffocating, making every breath feel like swallowing ash. David's hands were slick with sweat as he fought to wrench the window open. His fingers burned against the scorching glass, but he refused to stop. They had no time. The fire was coming for them. Finally, with one last shove, the window screeched open, and fresh air rushed in, though it was still tainted with smoke. Outside, the fire escape clung to the side of the burning building, its metal frame glowing in spots from the intense heat. The structure groaned, barely holding on. It was their only way out, but it looked ready to collapse at any moment. Bulit moved first. The brave dog sprang forward, leaping onto the fire escape with practiced ease. His paws landed lightly on the metal grating, testing its strength. The structure shuddered under his weight, but held firm. His ears perked, his sharp eyes scanning ahead. There was no time to hesitate. David held baby Charles close, wrapping him tightly in the blanket. The child barely stirred, his tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. David hesitated, his heart hammering in his chest. The fire escape was too unstable. If it broke under his weight, they could all fall. His gaze locked on Bulit, whose stance was steady, his expression determined. Then, without warning, the dog stepped forward and gently took hold of the blanket in his powerful jaws. His grip was firm but careful, as if he knew exactly how fragile the baby was. For a moment, David's instincts screamed to hold on tighter, but something in Bulit's eyes told him to trust. Slowly, he released his hold, letting the dog carry Charles with delicate precision. Bulit moved swiftly but cautiously, each step measured as he descended. The metal groaned beneath him, shifting under his weight. David climbed through the window next, his muscles tensed as he lowered himself onto the platform. The heat from the fire below seared his skin. The escape swayed, bolts loosening from the wall. Every step felt like walking on a tightrope above a burning pit. Just as he reached the next platform, a violent crack split the air. The section of the fire escape above them, weakened by the fire, suddenly gave way with a deafening screech of tearing metal. David barely had time to react before part of the railing snapped, sending a cascade of fiery debris tumbling down. He flinched, shielding his face as sparks rained over him. Bulit, still holding Charles, moved faster. With a powerful push of his hind legs, he leaped over the last set of stairs, landing hard but steady on the final landing. The baby remained secure in his grip. The moment his paws hit the ground, he released the blanket, gently placing the child onto the pavement. His tail wagged slightly as he checked the baby, making sure he was safe. David wasn't as lucky. As he tried to follow, the escape beneath him let out an eerie creak, the metal shifting dangerously. He had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he jumped, his hands barely catching the edge of the platform. His arms screamed in protest as he pulled himself up, legs scrambling for footing. The fire escape let out one last groan before giving way entirely, the twisted metal crashing down just as he pushed off. He hit the ground hard, his knees buckling under the impact, but he was alive. Breathing heavily, he turned his head and saw Charles lying safely on the pavement. The baby let out a small whimper, but remained still, his tiny fingers curling slightly. Relief flooded through David as he crawled toward him. His shaking hands reached out, brushing against Charles's warm skin. He was breathing, weak but alive. Then he felt something else, a warm presence beside him. He turned and met Bulit's deep brown eyes. The dog lowered his head slightly, his tail flicking once as if asking, "Did we do good?" David swallowed the lump in his throat, his vision blurring with emotion. He reached out and pulled Bulit close, his fingers gripping the dog's fur tightly. "You saved him," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You saved us all." Bulit licked David's hand, then nudged the baby softly with his nose before lowering himself onto the ground beside them. His body remained tense, muscles still ready for another fight, as if expecting danger to return at any moment. But the battle was over. The fire, the fear, the desperate race against time. It was behind them now. They had made it out, and Charles was safe. Olivia barely seemed to notice anything else as she stumbled forward and fell to her knees, her sobs breaking through the thick, smoky air. Her arms wrapped tightly around Charles, holding him close as if she would never let go. His tiny fingers grasped weakly at her shirt, his soft whimper barely audible over the distant crackling of flames. He was alive. He was in her arms. Relief crashed over her like a wave, her body shaking with emotion. David sank beside her, his chest rising and falling in heavy, exhausted breaths. His body ached. His face was streaked with soot, but all he could focus on was the baby. His eyes never left Charles, watching every small movement, needing to see for himself that the child was truly safe. Bulit stood beside them, his legs trembling, his once glossy fur now covered in ash. His breathing was still fast, but despite the exhaustion weighing on him, his tail gave a small, tired wag. He had done what he set out to do. He had protected the baby. With tears streaming down her face, Olivia lifted her gaze to the brave dog who had risked everything for her son. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers gently running over Bulit's head. "You saved my baby," she whispered, her voice breaking with gratitude. David let out a shaky breath, his throat tight with emotion as he placed a hand on Bulit's back. "We couldn't have done it without you," he murmured. Bulit let out a soft whine, stepping closer. He lowered his head and pressed his nose against Charles's tiny body, his breath warm against the baby's blanket. It was as if he needed to be sure, needed to feel the gentle rise and fall of the baby's chest, to know for certain that he was still breathing. Only then did he let out a quiet sigh and settle beside them, finally allowing himself to rest.